Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to give us a follow and turn on notifications so you can stay up to date with all the conversations that we're bringing you every single week. Now today, I'm going to share with all of you a chat that I had with the lead pastor of the Ridge, Mark Weigt. Now in this conversation, we talk about politics. No, not which politics you should have, but rather why politics can be so divisive, why that's a problem, and what we can do about it. This is my conversation with Mark. Well, hey, Mark, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Always, my friend. Always. Love it.
So, I mean, I know this might be officially official once this airs, but how do you feel about your boy Russell Wilson joining the, what is it, the Villains? What's the Steelers' official name?
Well, it couldn't get any worse than it did last year with Mitch Trubisky, so we'll take it.
Yeah, you keep on moving from staff members, old teammate to staff, right? So you got Tyler with Trubisky and me with Russell Wilson.
Oh, yeah. And just jumps around.
Is Aaron Rodgers, is that next year?
When he's 44, I'm sure that's
exactly,
when we'll get him.
Yeah.
That's when we'll get him.
Well, hey, speaking of divisive topics, so we're heading into a year where, obviously 2024 presidential election this year, politics are going to be the forefront of a lot of people's minds. This last weekend, when this airs, you'll have just spoken on the importance of unity. And it wasn't about politics per se, but it definitely incorporates elements in saying, hey, this is the thing that's not, this is not going to help unity. Mm-hmm. Maybe starting off, just like as we're heading into this year, do you have any overall just like thoughts about politics and obviously not necessarily like your position on all these things, not what I'm saying, but.
Yeah, I think every pastor I've talked to, lead pastor I've talked to at least, they have been not looking forward to this year.
Can't imagine why.
Yeah, well, and I think obviously the reasons being just the divisiveness and the different things like that. Personally speaking, I kind of see this as a year of a redo for me as a leader, honestly, because I think in 2020, I personally did not lead our church well through a lot of that divisive stuff, and learned a lot from that, and had to repent for some of that stuff. I just didn't feel like I led very well, prepared our church well, prepared people well. And so this year it's a little bit, hopefully I'll do a better job of that. And I feel a little bit more of a year of redemption as we kind of move forward, for me, at least personally speaking.
Wow. Thanks for your transparency and vulnerability and sharing that. That can't be, that's heavy. That's a lot of like heavy thoughts. And I know that there's a weight to your leadership position. And so I imagine like, as you're thinking about going through that again, like you use the word redemption, right? Mm-hmm. What goes into that thought process?
Well, and it sounds very selfish. Okay. So when I say redemption for me, but I mean we're called to serve and point people to Jesus and to follow Jesus. And a part of that is dealing with the things that are going on in our country and in our world. And I didn't think I did a good enough job doing that for people and really preparing them for what was coming and what we were experiencing at the time. And so being able to go, okay, God, we're going to do different this year. And we're going to talk about these things. We're going to wrestle with these things. We're going to dive headfirst into these things and not be afraid because of all the noise and the echo chamber. We're just not going to do that. Yeah. Because I just think the Bible has so many great things to say about this. And that brings us freedom and clarity rather than all the noise and the fear and the anger and all that stuff. And so I'm really looking forward. I say redemption. I'm hoping it's going to be redemption for our church.
Yeah, I don't think that comes across in a selfish way at all, Mark. I think that comes across in a way of like, man, I had an opportunity that I felt like I could have helped more. And I don't know if I did as much as I could have. And I think everybody has that element to some degree. So I don't think it's that area of, I don't feel like that's a selfish thing at all. It sounds more selfless, honestly, because it's a harder thing to talk about, right? It's not necessarily like a topic that I'm sure like there's a lot of like, it's an explosive topic. I'll say it that way.
Well, yeah, the when you speak about it from stage, you just don't get to know everybody personally. So they come in with their filter, and I have a filter, all right. But there is not a lot of time to build just that deep relational trust where you can have those conversations. It presses up against the filter, and then usually people respond quickly. And in our environment nowadays, the response is often, I'm going to tune you out, shut you down, or like our series is called, cancel you altogether. But I think people are ready for the conversation. And I think people are looking for different options on how we walk through this election year.
You mentioned the relational aspect. I think it's so interesting because I think that what I've seen is that regardless of relational status with somebody, politics can be so divisive. And I don't think that's going to be a shocking thing for people that are listening to hear that. They're like, oh, wow, politics can be divisive. Mm-hmm. But I do think that maybe just starting there, why do you think that is? Why is it that, you'll see people that are almost willing to, I don't want to say throw away relationships, but fight so hard on these topics, on politics. Why do you think it is that they can be so divisive?
Yeah, I thought about this question a little bit because I figured you were asking it. And so I think this is a multi-layer answer.
Okay.
And even in my answer, I'm not giving all of it. I think there's even more layers to it. And I think it's a couple. One, I think it's the political strategy of both parties. It's fear and anger. And that's the strategy. Those raise money. Hope and change don't raise money. Okay. Hope and good, everything's good, doesn't raise money. It just doesn't. Fear and anger does. The other thing is that with the advancement of technology, with the fear and anger, we're bombarded all the time. We just see it all the time now. Yeah. No matter where we are, it's always there. And then we have algorithms, which now we all create our own echo chambers. And so now it's the constant voice of I'm right, they're wrong. And so, that's a part of all that. A third thing is, here's what I just call it. And this is not to be demeaning. I think this is just the reality. And most pastors in the country would say the same thing. It's a lack of discipleship that's causing it. That most people who follow Jesus, their political filter is over their Jesus filter. And so, because it's just basic stuff when you follow Jesus, here's how you treat people. And it's because how you treat people matters to God more than being right. But we're seeing, in the church world and all that stuff, that's out the window. We know that looking at major issues that of our day, even that Jesus wasn't a Democrat and he wasn't a Republican, but we act as if he was. And then because we have our one or two issues that we hold on to, and then we place Jesus there. And then we think okay, this is how Jesus is, and he was this, and he's on my side. Actually, he's not on our side. And so there's a lack of discipleship. And I just scratched the surface on that one. We can just keep going. And then, just for the kind of final one is, I think this is really important. Here's how I say it, John.
Yeah.
We don't elevate ourselves above the fray. And here's what I mean by that. When you elevate yourself above all the noise and the arguments and the, all that stuff, here's what we find. There's a spiritual enemy we have who seeks to divide. And so he loves this, especially with God's people. He loves it. And then, not only that, but we see throughout the scriptures that sometimes God would allow things to happen and that were against what you would think that he would want to happen. But it was his way of either going, hey, I'm going to get your attention, or, whether it be divine judgment, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Okay. But we don't think even along that line. Hey, we don't go, what is God trying to say here? Every president that gets elected, I always go, okay, God appoints leaders. So that means God allowed that to be. And I always go, what might God be trying to say to us because he has allowed this person to be in leadership of our country, no matter what the party is. Okay.
Yeah.
And so if we believe that God appoints leaders, we don't have to agree with those leaders, but you know what it is? We are called to pray for them. We are called to handle things differently because we really believe that. So I call it, we don't elevate ourselves above the fray. We stay in the fray. And as a result, we don't see these higher things that God would want us to see based on a biblical worldview. Those are the truth.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. You're right. Those, like, each one of those things could be its own topic to dive into. Yeah. I was reading this article on Carey Nieuwhof's blog, written by Joe, I think it's Terrell. And it was like 10 different conversational principles. And he starts off the whole thing talking about this TED Talk that he was listening to about how that people associate the negative aspects of being wrong with realizing they're wrong. Mm-hmm. And so it's like people hate to be wrong, specifically if they realize it. They don't want to be known that they're wrong. And so then you have like the digging in and the trenches. And I think that hits home with that elevate above concept, because it's
and John, there's part of the issue right there. Yeah. As far as why do we look at it as being wrong or right? Why can't we look at, we all have examples of where we maybe believed something, let's just say socially. And then as we grew as a person or grew as a Jesus follower, especially, we were like, you know what? There's more to that than what I thought or than what I knew or what I based my decision on. And so as a result, I may have changed my opinion or may have changed my belief in that. That's not being right or wrong. That's called growth. And so when you see it as right and wrong, like you said, and you're going to grab onto that baby and go, I can't because I don't want to be wrong. You already are. We all have stories that we are. It's okay. Instead, have the humility to just go, man, as I take steps with Jesus, I'm going to grow into things that I'm currently not into. And that's okay. There's freedom in that. So like I said, I get it. And there's also the same guy that you're talking about also has things that say people like to be angry about something and hold on to that anger. Hence the political strategy of fear and anger. Yeah.
Is there anything with kind of being that you mentioned the bombardment, and it's almost like a cultural, I don't want to say identity, but it's like this cultural kind of, that's the culture right now, right? Is the anger, the fear, the pick a side. Yeah. When you're being bombarded by that, how do you, like you mentioned, rise above? How do you tune that out? Is it limiting the voices? Is it recognizing what it is? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it is. That's why I said above the fray.
Yeah.
You have to recognize that for what it is. And you also, I do this fun thing every once in a while. I'm kind of a political junkie to some ways. There's so much you learn about culture and people through the political process. Okay. And so I've always enjoyed it. But when you are, I did this. So I did this thing where I watched a couple clips on Fox News and then MSNBC back to back. And there was like, I matched up the buttons that were talking at the time and all that stuff. And here's the interesting thing. They were talking about the same things, the same topic. And so the one was like, we care about freedom. And then the other was like, we care about freedom and we got to fight for freedom. And the other was, we got to fight for freedom. And they were talking about the same stuff.
Yeah.
And it was just really funny to watch and go, oh gosh, we got to rise above that. So yeah, limiting that, understanding that, the more you watch of something, the world, it's going to create a echo chamber for you. And it's meant to, because they want to keep your attention and they want to keep you clicking. And so I think it's things like that. And I also think there's this idea of just having the humility to go, I don't have all the answers.
I think there's an element to, Mark, like you mentioned this briefly. We talked about this before, you and I, where it's like, okay, there's certain issues for people that are just a little bit closer to the heart than other ones. Yeah. Like then there's specific ones and whatever it is, it could be anything really, but there's that, maybe it's that core issue that's just closer to the heart. And it's a lot harder to release those core things. Maybe there's an experience, that's part of the value of learning people's stories, right? And you even mentioned that in the beginning, like you don't know somebody's story, you don't know them personally. So it's hard to talk on stage to all these things, right? Is there a way, because I'm sure you have those too, like those ones that touch closer to your heart, right? Is there a way to release those things a little bit easier, like, and recognize those things? And because you want to still care about them, but you don't want them to be the only thing that impacts you, right?
Well, and I think, even to go into it a little bit further, John, I think there are some issues that as Jesus followers, we're called to care about. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is okay. And some of those are part of our stories.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay as well. There's nothing wrong with that. And that might be a passion point of ours. Once again, I think that's fantastic. I think where we have to take the next step is in how we approach those things, how we communicate those things, how we treat people and talk about those things. And I think that's where just being wise, really loving people, because God loves all people. It's not just he loves one side and all that stuff. And I think that's where the stuff, and here's the other thing. Here's what I've noticed is that most people vote because they have two or three issues that are important to them that sometimes most of the time benefit them.
Yeah.
And they're good with that. And so they're going to vote for that because of that very reason. I think we need to realize that.
Yeah.
And the other side, whoever the other side might be, they have two or three issues that they have the same filter. The same filter.
You touched on this a little bit in like the idea of like discipleship. But a lot of the ways that we interact with people, the conversations we have, the divisiveness that we create, maybe it's in a specific way in how we talk about a political issue. But I imagine a lot of times maybe there's a core issue. I'll call it like not like a political issue, but like a character trait or something that you personally need to grow in or develop in, right? Maybe it's like an anger, whatever it is.
Yeah.
That might make these types of like conversations more challenging. Do you think there's any ones in general that you're like, oh, I need to wrestle with this myself and grow in this area before I'm able to have healthy political conversations with people?
Yeah, I think as a culture, we're not really good at stopping and assessing our responses. We're not really good at it because our responses have become normalized, even if they're divisive or explosive and things like that. So there's got to be, once again, if the filter is you want to follow Jesus and you want to have God's heart for people, which he has a deep heart for people, okay? If you want to do that, then we got to have the discipline and the humility to look at some of our responses and go, ooh, why am I responding that way? So for example, if you're getting defensive or angry, if you find yourself saying those people and all that stuff, if you're starting to do that, then you got to ask yourself, why am I responding that way? What's the real reason for my response? And it's not because they're wrong and I'm right. It goes further than that.
Yeah.
It might be, why are you more passionate about your political platform and party than Jesus's platform? And you got to ask yourself that question, because most people who are politically passionate and they kind of Jesus filters number 2, they post about their political stuff more than they would ever post about the Jesus stuff. And so that would be called an idol. And that would be something that's pretty important for us to dig into, because there's a lot linked in there. Because as we know about idol worshiping and idols, anything we put ahead of God, there's reasons why we do that. And so you want to get at the heart of that. I'd also say, why are you fighting against people that Jesus died for? And you got to ask yourself that question. Well, because they are, okay, so you don't think Jesus had that issue in the New Testament? The people in the New Testament had that issue. They had it worse than us.
Yeah.
They were in Rome, for crying out loud. All right. They were killing their family members and all that stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
And then why is being right more important than relationships being right? So there's some questions there that are very, very important questions that most Christians won't answer, that are really politically charged.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to get at the heart of that. They're justifying it with, I'm right. This is where God would hold this position, all these reasons, but they don't answer or ask the most important questions.
I imagine that's probably an opportunity. Like if you have some close, trusted friends in your life, where that's a great opportunity to like, I don't know, talk through some of those things with them, right? You got to trust them, right? And so there's that element too. But I imagine like, hey, this is how I'm feeling about this thing. Does that seem justified? Does that seem, you know what I mean? Like, would that be a fair process to go through?
I think anytime you're slamming people or a group of people, it should be a red flag, because one of the litmus tests for how we're growing with God is how we treat people.
Yeah.
And so if we're not treating people well, or we're degrading people, whatever it may be, whether they're right or wrong isn't the issue. It is how we see people that's the issue. Yeah. Because if we see people through God's eyes, let's just say they hold a viewpoint that we know Jesus wouldn't hold, we're not going to get angry. It's going to be a different response. It really is. And so it's not righteous anger. It's arrogant anger.
Yeah.
It's prideful anger.
How do you reprioritize that? I mean, I'm sure there's like a correct, like if there's a hierarchy of priorities in your life. I know you got God, you got family, you got your hierarchy there. And somewhere, under those, I'm gonna guess there is where the politics stuff comes in, right? Because like you've said before, and I love that you said this, politics are important. Like those things are they're meaningful, right? There's a stewardship element to that. There's a how we like can care as a government for those things. Those things are important, but they're not the most important thing. How do you reprioritize that?
Yeah, and I'm glad you reiterated that. Yeah, vote. It's important. It's a privilege in this country. All that stuff, man. I mean, leadership is important. It matters. All that stuff. Okay. Yeah. I would say this. I look at this as a question that kind of cuts through all that, because we'd all know the stock answer: God and family. Okay, everybody says that, right? But then why does something like politics really rise to the top of it, and then we just sprinkle God in and use God as a justification for it?
Ooh.
So here's the question I think you need to ask. If you look at where does politics fall into just our worldview, the priorities of our life, I would say this. Here's a question you got to answer. What is the best way to change and transform a community? That's got to be the question you got to ask. Now, if you really think that politics, laws, and legislation is going to do that, which I would argue it won't, all right, the right laws and legislation matters, but it doesn't change hearts. Yeah. Change hearts, change families and communities and all that stuff. So if you think, laws and legislation do that, then that's why your political filter is on top. If you don't think it's the most important thing, and you think, no, only just really a move of God's Spirit through our country or our community is going to do that because that's going to change hearts, well, then guess what's going to be on top for you when it comes to this whole thing? It's going to be the Jesus filter. It's going to be, man, God, you're going to be on top. You have to move, because it doesn't matter who's in office. If hearts don't change, it doesn't change. It's just going to continue to just get worse. And here's what we know. If you say if so-and-so gets elected, things will get better. Why is it that when every time so-and-so gets elected, then it's not enough? We need more people. And then we need more people. And then the cycle change. And every year it's the most important election ever. And guess what? The next 4 years will be the most important election ever. And it'll repeat and repeat and repeat. It's just like, that's not it.
Yeah.
We just got to grab a hold of that and go, man, there's something better.
I think that's so good. I think especially like, that's got to be a continual process, right? Because it's like I don't know. I just know that from my own journey and story is like, there are times where I'm like, oh yeah, God's up top. And then it's so easy for that, whatever that busy, stressful thing is to slowly kind of creep up. And it's like, no, it's that continual daily, for me at least, prayer. It's being like, God, no, you are at the top. Help me do that. And then when I'm not acting that way, how can I put you back up there?
Well, and we know this. I mean, we know that there are people in our country that are doing some really bad stuff.
Yeah.
In both parties, okay? But I mean, they're doing some bad stuff that are hurting innocent people.
Yeah.
And so it is easy to get angry.
Yeah.
And all that stuff. And here's the thing. What we're talking about here, I'm not saying that there aren't issues that as Jesus followers that we shouldn't step out on and lead the way for change.
Right.
So there are, okay? But it always needs to be done with grace and truth. Grace and truth. But there's tension there. There's tension there.
Okay. So if we acknowledge that, okay, God's up top, but at the same time, politics important, like you mentioned, issues. So we should be able to talk about it. Maybe when do we talk about it? Do we talk about it with everybody? Do we talk about it with nobody? Like how do we go about this?
Well, I think it's important to talk about. I do.
Yeah.
I think it's important to have a group of people. I think that group of people should be small and safe. That's the way I look at it. Mm-hmm. Small and safe. Small and safe being you don't want to be talking to everybody.
Yeah.
Because not everybody can handle the conversation. Mm-hmm. So you may think you're talking to someone that's safe, but they're not safe. Yeah. They're just listening, and in their mind, they're going, oh, I'm canceling this person. They're done. I'm not talking to them, all that stuff. So I think the small and safe is really important. I think the ability to have these type of conversations are not only important because we need to have them and we want to have them, but there's things that we need to be a place where we wrestle with some of these things. So we're not just having these conversations with a bunch of buddies who are, voting the way we are, and we're like, man, can you believe? No, it needs to be. It's funny. I have a group of pastor friends that we have political conversations, and we don't all vote the same. And it's great because we talk about some of these issues, and it's just a safe place to talk about them. And we laugh and we joke about it and all that stuff. And it's great and it's lighthearted. But when I say small and safe, it's small. Once again, you got to keep that circle tight, and safe from the standpoint, they have a proper perspective of where it falls. And when you have that, you can have that conversation, and you should have that conversation, but keep it small.
Yeah. And I mean, I would imagine that most people can probably tell if somebody's going to be a safe person to talk to about those things. But I do think there's an element to, first and foremost, you need to be a safe person to talk to about those things. Like if somebody starts talking to you about those things and then you blow up and said, well, if you think that, well, then you're blah, 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 blah. It's like, okay, well, now that person's not going to be safe to talk to.
Yeah. Well, that's really well said. I mean, if you're not safe, and here's the thing, you attract who you are. So if you're not safe, you ain't attracting safe people.
Yeah.
And if you're safe, you'll be more. I have this neighbor. He's great. He's one of my ones. Love him to death. And he votes we vote different. But what's fun about it is we have fun with it all the time.
Yeah.
And he knows I'm safe, and he doesn't have anybody safe to talk to, but he knows I'm safe, and he doesn't know this, but I can be safe because I love him more than who he votes for. And so for me, it doesn't matter. I don't care.
So this is an interesting question. If you take the perspective and you're probably not going to change that person's mind, right? Where does the value come from in talking with them? Because I think that for some people, it's like either one, they're like, I'm doing this because if you don't change your mind, there's a lot there, right? But like you say, probably this person's they're not gonna have their mind changed when you talk about it. But I would think that we both agree there's still a lot of value in being able to discuss those things with them. Where does that come from?
My goal in talking with someone is never to change their mind. I think that's point one. Anytime your main drive in talking with someone about it is to change their mind, unless it's one of those hard issues that we're talking about before, and that's different, a different category.
Yeah, sure.
But if your drive is to change their political opinion, you've got the wrong motives for talking to them. And here's the thing, you will not be safe. Once again, if you're looking for a safe conversation, then you approach it with love and grace and humility, knowing that I don't have all the answers. He or she might know something that I don't, and I'm going to learn something from this. I'm going to walk away from something I can think about a little bit more. And if we do get into a discussion, here's my approach. My approach isn't going to be, well, you should what, or so-and-so. It's, hey, tell me about, or why do you think this, or where do you think that came from, or how do you see this going on right now? How do you interpret that? So it's asking questions to get them to talk versus what most people do is they tell them their opinion. And then what happens is that people build up walls and then they get defensive versus really expressing curiosity and asking the right questions that can lead to a healthy conversation.
I think that's really good. I mean, because then you're actually coming at it from, I think, like a genuine perspective of like, oh, this is an issue like I'm not going to have all the answers on. Like I loved back to that article I was talking about earlier with Joe Terrell, like his first point was, you're not an expert. which I just love because it's kind of like calling out, like, and if you are an expert, you're probably not arguing on it, right? It's like there's somebody like, maybe that's too blunt.
Well, no, I mean, think about it. I mean, we are on the outside of a lot of problems. And we always say this, the leadership principle, I forgot who said this, but the easiest solutions are the problems we're the furthest from. So a lot of these problems, these problems, you know, we talk about, even during Live Big, we talk about things like poverty and all that. Well, my view of poverty has changed so much in the last 10 years. And you know why? Because we're in the middle of it now. It's not far anymore.
Yeah.
And so it's changed. And I think the expert idea is to go, that's the humility to go, man, okay, here's where I am, but there might be more. And you know what? I don't have all the facts and figures here. I have my party's facts and figures, but I'm not in the trenches necessarily. So I think there's a lot to that, John.
Yeah. And it sounds like, and you brought this up with asking lots of good questions. It sounds like you're almost like you're earning that right to have that conversation, because the more questions, the more curious you are. Yeah. I think we all know, like in natural conversation, you should be able, there's like an element of your sharing too, right? But you earn that, right? You earn that by genuinely being interested in their perspective and maybe saying, oh, interesting, I hadn't thought about it that way before, you know?
Well, how many times do we go into a conversation? We've all done this, all right? Yeah. Where it's like, we've already got our mind loaded and the bullets are in there and we just start firing. We're not listening. We ask a question, but we're just waiting for them to get done because we want to just fire our shots off.
Yeah.
Versus waiting for someone to ask us what we think.
Yeah.
It's a whole different ballgame.
And I think, gosh, just to your point, I think that's kind of how I'm going to blame culture here, but I think that's kind of ingrained in culture is that kind of mentality, right? Whether it's sitcoms or movies or talk shows, whatever it is, it's this, how do you get the one line zinger, the gotcha, the like, see, I was right. I said the funny, clever thing. And it's just about, it's for yourself, right? It's not for the other person.
You know, I sat down with, this was a couple of years ago. It was great. Sat down with a couple of young leaders from our church, and I was just asking them questions and learning about just generationally them and how they see things and all that stuff. And one of the things that has always stuck out to me, and they said this, okay, I didn't say this, but we were talking about the what we're talking about here, and that's giving our opinions and all that stuff, just posting about it and all that stuff. And I said, do you not care what the other side is receiving and how they're receiving it and all that stuff? And they said, no, not at all. And I finally said, so why is that? And here's what came out of it. Our opinion matters more than people. And I was like, whoa, I never thought about it that way. But I think now that's a cultural thing. Our opinion matters more than people.
How do we, and maybe this is just, I don't know if there's a simple answer for this. How do we make that not the case?
I think give your opinion less.
I was right. Simple answer.
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I know. And inside we're like, yeah, but everybody else is. Okay. Everybody else is jumping off a bridge. Do you jump off a bridge? I mean, it's kind of the same idea. It's just because everybody does it, and that's a cultural thing, it doesn't mean it's the wise thing. Yeah. If you want to, because once you start giving your opinion on stuff like that's divisive like this, here's what you sacrifice. Influence. And influence is the most important thing you have. Once you lose influence, it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. And so once again, we just got to kind of rise above that and be wise and go, I know we all love to give our opinions. I love to give my opinions. We all do. But what's more important than our opinion? Our influence.
You know, we've talked about this as a staff. I don't know if you've mentioned it before, Mark, but one of the places where we can easily lose our influence is social media. Just because it's so easy, and there's like there's no personal connection. It's just so easy, whether that's a comment section. I mean, if you want to lose faith in humanity, just go to the comment section of whether it's social media or YouTube video or whatever. Do you have any advice or suggestions for social media when it comes to politics? Because, I mean, I guess there's certain things, right, that maybe they're not political. I don't know. What are your thoughts on how do we use social media.
I would say this, John. I would say if you're a political poster,
Yeah.
if that's what you like to do,
Hashtag.
yeah, that's right. Personalize it for a minute. How often do you change your opinion or view on something because someone else posts something different? Or look at it this way: do you see that, and because you love posting about politics, or do you just get annoyed and it causes you to react? Most people, I had this one person I asked this question to, they said, well, one time I did, and I go, so 1 out of 1,000 is a good percentage, and you're going to use that strategy because you did it once? Let's be real. It doesn't work. Even if you have exception stories, those are exception stories. All right. So if it doesn't work on you, why would you do the very thing to others that doesn't work on you?
Yeah.
And so there's this idea of don't do what you know doesn't work. And not only does it not work, it costs you your influence. There was a dude who one time attended here, and I had this conversation with him. He's posting all this stuff online about this political party, and if you believe this, and he said these words. He said, how can you believe these things? And was calling people pretty much stupid and all that stuff. And I'm reading this and I'm going, oh, and my heart just broke, because here's the thing. If there's people in his life who are in need or maybe get interested in God, they'll never turn to him. They'll never turn to him because he's not safe, and he's lost their influence, and he's lost influence with them all over something that changed 4 years after that.
Yeah.
And it's just not worth it.
Yeah. I mean, that's, and maybe that's a hard thing for some people right now listening to hear, but I think that's a really necessary thing. Like, is it effective? And are you going to lose influence with people? I think those are two really, that's really good.
Here's the thing. You will lose influence with people. It's an absolute. You will lose influence because people don't have the filter to be able to go, oh, I get what he's trying to say, or I get what she's trying to say. They don't. They just, oh, he's or she's this. And so as a result, no, I'm sorry. I don't agree. I always tell
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, as a pastor, I've talked to some other pastors, the fastest way to grow a church right now is to pick a side politically. It's the fastest way to grow a church. To do what we're talking about right now is the most difficult way for a church to grow, but it's the most effective because now we can connect with all the people in our community, not just a segment that agrees with us politically.
And you've used this line before, but that's what heaven's going to look like. Heaven's going to look like both political parties. Heaven's going to look like, shocker to some of you out there that may have a different thought process, but that's what it's going to look like. And I don't know. I want to be on good terms. So.
Well, there's some dynamic Christian leaders that are Democrat, and there's some dynamic Christian leaders that are Republican, that have been Republican. If you look back, and they're both going to be there.
Yeah. Well, Mark, maybe I'll end on this. Is there any final thoughts? We're going into this year, like we've talked about earlier. We're going into this year. We're going into this election cycle, and we know it's going to be so easy to be divisive. Do you have any closing thoughts, or maybe a hope for our church or people listening to this?
Yeah, and then we have the RNC coming here in July, which should be fun. And I've talked to some people on the police force and all that, and they just internally are just like, oh man, it's just going to be brutal, all that stuff. And I think just a couple thoughts. One is stay above the fray. Stay above the fray. Be wise. Vote. It's another one. Vote. And then here's a third one. People ask me about resources or topics, things that will help them. And here's what I always go back to. There are a couple passages in the scriptures that are so helpful. And then I'm going to close us with one.
Yeah.
Here are a couple passages you got to read. Matthew 22:34-40. John 13:34-35. The message I gave was on John 17. Huge one when it comes to this. Huge one. This is Jesus's last prayer. He obviously saw this coming. And then here's the passage that politically aggressive Christians never refer to. Okay, they never do. I've even showed it to some of them, and they just get mad. And of course you get mad because it flies in the face with what they're saying, and it's so wise. Okay, it's so wise. Here's what the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. I'm going to read it. He says, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, and intercessions and thanksgiving be made for all people. And so I love this. He's like, hey, this is our part of our calling is we intercede, we pray for the community, the city that we're in. And then he says for all people, then he says this, and he gets specific, for kings and all those in authority, which is interesting. When he's referring to kings, he was referring to emperors as well. And most likely this was written when Emperor Nero was in power, who was killing Christians. He was burning them at the stake. And here's Paul going, yep, we pray for him. And all those in authority, which for us would be president, Congress, all city officials, all that stuff. And then he says, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. Peaceful and quiet in a culture that is loud and no one's listening because they can't hear. And then he says this, I love how he ends it. This is good and pleases God our Savior. And then here's the reason, who wants all people to be saved and come to knowledge of the truth. And he wants all of them. That means we can't lose our influence and we can't get involved in a division. So I just love that passage during this time to remind myself, oh man, well, they didn't understand. They understand more than we do. And that's our calling. And our calling is something better. And that's to influence people, not for a party, but for something greater. And that's God's kingdom.
Thanks for closing with that. Thanks for closing with that, Mark. That's really good. Thank you. Thanks for sharing on this topic and giving us a framework to head into this next year with these kind of thoughts in our minds. So thank you.
Yeah, I love it. Like I said, I think this is an important topic that we continue to talk about throughout this year. I do. So thanks for having me.
Well, that was my conversation with Mark. And I think I'm going to let Mark's reading from the Apostle Paul carry the weight on this and just say, let's all commit to praying for our community and for our leaders, regardless of the party that they're a part of. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast. Make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.